Today I am going to show you how to sew this halter front jumpsuit with a racer back. If you need the pattern for it, you can check it out here. It is an intermediate to advanced sewing, so it has tons of details. So let's jump right into it. Okay, so the very first thing is to finish the side seams on my front bodice. And next I'm going to go ahead and pleat the neckband of my halter. And I'm just going to go ahead and use a straight pin to pin each of the lines together, front to back, and then I'm just going to go ahead and stitch it. Okay, and so I will just keep pleating in the same manner until I have all of my pleating done. So I have a small strip of fabric here that I'm going to sew a seam about 1/4 of an inch, and then I'm going to trim it and turn it, and this is going to serve as my button loop. So once I'm done, it's going to look nice and neat, and then I'm going to sew it onto my front bodice. The next step is to find the markings on the bodice for the button loop and the buttonhole, and we're going to sew our button loop on the right side of our left bodice. And also make sure that the loop is facing towards the armhole. Okay, so I have finished the raw edge of my facing, and I've gone ahead and attached it to my bodice, right sides to right sides. But because this is a linen fabric and the weave is a very loose weave, I am going to use stay tape on the seam of my facing so that it does not stretch. Okay, so I just want to point out as a reminder, remember to transfer all of your markings from your pattern onto your fabric so that you'll know exactly where to place everything. I even marked the stay tape, so that's very important. And I also want to point out that I sewed my stay tape right down the middle, 1/4 of an inch, and I marked where I'm going to place my stay tape. Now the next thing to do, and you know how important it is to understitch, so I'm going to go ahead and understitch my facing so that it lays flat and neat on the wrong side of my bodice. Next, press your facing nice and flat, and then sew a basting stitch to attach the two front pieces together. Make sure to baste in between the markings so that you can get a nice crisscross and that the cross is nice and even. The next step is to finish the raw edges of the back bodice all the way around, all except for the armhole. Next, attach the front bodice to the two back pieces at the side seam and give it a nice press. Okay, so after you've created a 1/2 inch seam allowance attaching the front to the back, the next step is to go ahead and create a nice stay stitch all around the armhole. Next, prepare your bias binding for your armhole. You can use packaged bias binding if you like, but I am using bias binding that is the same as my fashion fabric. I don't want to use packaged. I want my binding to match my fashion fabric for this project. You're going to measure the armhole, and for me, I cut 2 strips and I sewed them together at the middle. So this is going to be my side seam where I stitched the 2 pieces together. Then I'm just going to fold them in half. This is 2-inch bias binding. When I fold it in half, I get 1 inch. So just go ahead and press that nice and neat. And once you have that 1 inch, and then you're going to go ahead and fold it again, and then you'll have a 1/2 inch. Now I want to mention that I am not going to sew my bias binding all the way to the end of my front. Now that's because this is my center seam for the back, and as you can see for my facing, you see that it does not go all the way to the center back seam. You can see that it's about 2.5 to 3 inches away, but I stopped about 3 inches and I left a small piece, a small little opening, and I'm going to do the same thing for my bias binding. Okay, so now we're ready to attach the bias binding to the armhole, which is nicely prepared with a stay stitch. First, I am going to trim my bias binding down by 1/2 of an inch. And the reason why I do this is because it reduces bulk. One thing you don't want on a lightweight fabric is a lot of bulk. So I'm going to go and trim 1/2 of an inch. Okay, so I've pinned my bias binding securely in place. I use a lot of pins because I don't want it to stretch in any way. Now I want to remind you again that I want to reduce bulk, so I am going to stop sewing my bias binding just as I did on the facing and leave about 1/2 of an inch, as you can see. So I'm going to come down about 3 inches from my center back seam, and then I'm going to stop about right here, 3 inches. So that's going to give me some room to leave a little bit of fabric on my bias binding so I can tuck it neatly under. So 3 inches from the center back seam. Okay, so here we have it. The next step is to understitch all the way around and then trim as close to the seam as possible. So the next step is to turn it under and give it a nice press. I prefer using my ham because that's going to help all of the seams stay set in. You want to set those seams in, and you want it to be nice and rounded into your armhole. So go ahead and grab your ham and set your iron on steam and press your armhole. Okay, so now it's time to attach my back neck facing. So remember, I left 1/2 inch loose on my facing as well as my armhole binding. So I'm going to go ahead and attach my facing, and where I stopped is where I will start stitching all the way around. So from here all the way around. And notice that I finished one raw edge on my facing, one of the short sides. And so I'm just going to go ahead and attach it. And when I do, I'm going to sew along my neckband, not along the facing. I'm going to use this as a guide. That's going to be my seam. And also I am going to lengthen my stitch on the side where my bias binding is, and that's going to be very important. This stitch is going to be longer than these stitches. Now I'm going to just go ahead and trim off my facing at a slant so that it matches my center back seam. Okay, so again, the bottom stitch should be a longer stitch because we're going to remove that stitch. We're going to remove this one, but the back stitch and the top stitch should be a normal stitch. So when we turn it, we want to make sure that that stitch can come loose easily. And I've also am going to cut my corners, so I reinforced the corners with the stitch by back stitching a couple of times. So when I cut it diagonally, that stitch is going to remain. Okay, so after attaching your button side facing and giving your armhole a nice press, the next step is to hand baste. So we're going to hand baste all the way around, making sure that it's nice and flat. And then I am going to do a nice top stitch. I like to top stitch on the right side of my garment. That way I know I get a nice even stitch all the way around. Okay, I want to point out something very important. Do not top stitch into your pleat. Stop right about here, then go ahead and hand stitch your binding down. Let me show you what that looks like on the sewing machine. Okay, so you want to start your 1/2 inch top stitch on your armhole bias binding, but you don't want to keep sewing all the way into your pleat or over your pleat or across your pleat. So here is where my pleat begins, and what I want to do is sew all the way up to that pleat, sew into the ditch, back stitch a couple of stitches, and then cut my thread. So then when I remove it, this is what it looks like, nice and neat. Okay, so now I am going to start on my other neck binding. So this one is going to include buttonhole loops. So I'm going to go ahead and create my buttonhole loops, and I'm just going to go ahead and create one long buttonhole loop, and I'm going to turn it and cut it in half, and that way I'll have two. Okay, so before I move on to the other side, I want to show you the herringbone stitch that I did on the front facing. This is really beautiful. It lays nice and flat. The stitch is visible on one side, and of course it's invisible on the other side. All right, so it lays nice and flat. I have it tucked nice and neatly under my neck facing. My neck facing is stitched on two sides, and the bottom side is stitched loosely so that I can remove it, and I'm going to be putting 2 buttons here. Now I'm going to do the other side exactly the way I did this side, except this side will not have buttons. It will have 2 loops for buttons. And I placed these here as holders, but I'm going to do this side exactly the same as the other side. So I want to talk about this loop really quick. I went back and I adjusted my button loop so that it faces down on about a 45-degree angle. It just did not look right protruding straight out at a 95-degree angle. Instead, it looks much better facing downward, and when I close the 2 front pieces together, it lays so nice and flat that way. Okay, so I have completed both sides, and I'm ready to attach the bottom of my jumpsuit. But before I do, let me just point out how well everything came out. my facings, my armhole, everything came out great. Now what I've done is I've made a basting stitch at the bottom of my bodice all the way across, and I am going to use that to ease the top of my bodice onto my bottom. So first I've done that. I am going to start working on the bottom before I attached my back halter to my neckband. So let's get started. Okay, so first start by finishing the raw edge of the front pants crotch area. Then go ahead and match right side to right sides and sew a 1/2 inch seam. Then you are going to match the pocket right sides to right side and pin it. For both sides, sew a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Next, understitch the pocket facing with a nice stitch very close to the seam. Then turn it over and clip your seams as close to the stitch as possible, and then give it a nice press. Next, match the pocket bag with the pocket lining. Make sure to match the notches on the side seam as well as the waistband. Once I've done that, then I'm going to just go ahead and baste along the waist and also do a basting stitch on the side seam. Now close your pocket up with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and finish the raw edge. Press the front seam allowance open with a nice iron and then continue the pocket on the other side. For the back pants, finish the raw edge and sew a 1/2 inch seam allowance right sides to right sides and press the seam allowance open. Next, pin the inseams together. Make sure to match the front and back seams. Pin it all the way from one end of the leg to the other end of the leg. Sew it together with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and then finish the raw edge. Okay, next open the pants and spread it on your ironing board and make sure the right side is facing up. Give it a nice press with the inseam facing towards the front of the pants. Once you finish pressing, go ahead and finish the raw edge of your hem. Now I'm going to finish my side seams, but I'm going to leave my side seams open and I'm going to finish the raw edges one at a time. I need to do that because I need to determine where I'm going to put my drawstring. Then I will sew the top part of my side seam together, leaving room to measure my drawstring placement, and then I will continue. Okay, so I measured up from my hem about 14 inches and I put a mark here. So this is where I stopped sewing down from my waistline. I stopped there and I backstitched a couple of times, and as you can see, I still have my opening. So what I'm going to do is make a encasing for my drawstring. It's going to be a little bit wider than my seam line, but before I do that, I am going to go ahead and create my hem. So first I'll turn up 1/4 inch and press, and then I'll turn up 1/2 inch and press. Okay, so now the next step is to make the tie for my side gathers on my leg. So I am going to create a rather skinny or small tie, and the seam needs to be sewn with a very small stitch, the shortest stitch possible, and you're going to sew 2 stitches very close to each other. I'm doing that because my weave on my fabric is loose, and as you know, once you start turning, you're going to get unraveling. So in order to prevent that, you need to use a very tight small stitch and do 2 or 3 stitches. That will prevent any unraveling. So my tie is going to be about 28 inches, and once I get the tie turned right side out, then I'm going to go ahead and top stitch it. That's going to even prevent it more from unraveling. Okay, next I need to see how much room I have for my tie. So I'm going to place my tie on my seam. So I already did my seam allowance, a 1/2 inch, all the way down to meet the mark, which is 14 inches from my hem. And then I am going to roll it over and measure. So it looks like I need about 5/8 of an inch. And before I sew my 5/8 of an inch casing, I'm going to turn this small little corner in so that it looks nice and neat and so that it doesn't stick out. Okay, so here is my 5/8 inch seam allowance for my casing, and from my 1/2 inch seam I sewed over about 2 stitches and sewed down to the bottom, and I also sewed the little triangle so that when it opens it looks nice and neat. So now I need to open my casing by cutting to the thread, but don't cut through. Be very careful not to cut your thread. And then when I open it, I have my 5/8 inch seam allowance, and I am going to press it open, and I'm going to sew up, over, and down. So I'm going to put my string in first, and I'm going to sew across this top so that the string stays in. Okay, so I have my casing sewn on the sides, and I have one drawstring in, and it came through very nicely. Now let me show you how I did it. It's very simple. You just put your tool through, you wrap a string or the thread from your string around your tool, and you just pull it through. And when it's all the way through, you just go ahead and flatten it out and then sew it nice and securely along the top of your casing. So up and over a couple of times so that make sure that that is nice and secure, and then there you have it. It's done. The next step is to prepare my invisible zipper. I'm going to sew it down to a mark that I've made, which is 12.5 inches down from my neck. And once I finish installing my zipper, I'm going to close up my back bodice from that mark with a 1/2 inch seam all the way down to my waistline, and then I'm going to go ahead and trim my zipper. The next step is to insert my back bodice into my back neck. So I've marked my point where I do not want my back neck to come down any further than that. Try to line up the center back neck seam as well as the center bodice back as close as possible, and then pin. Once everything is lined up nice and neat, then go ahead and edge stitch along the bottom of the neck. This will secure the back bodice. Okay, it looks good. It's ready to go. I have both sides in. They're nice and even, and now I can just go ahead and figure out what type of buttons I want, and I'm going to actually save that for last. In the meantime, I'm going to work on the drawstring casing for my waistline. So if you remember, my waist seam is 1 inch, and so I'm going to come down the 1 inch, but I'm going to come over from my center front seam about 2 inches. Okay, so I have interfaced the mark where I am going to make my buttonholes. My buttonholes are about 1/2 of an inch long, and they come down about 1/4 of an inch from my seam line. So when I fold down my 1 inch seam over my buttonhole, it's going to cover it, and the buttonhole will not be exposed. Next, attach the bodice to the pants, making sure to match the seams, all of the markings, and the notches. Then trim the excess. Do not trim the bodice, only trim the pants. Next, cut open the buttonholes and attach the 1 inch seam to the pants. So next I'm going to insert my drawstring, which can easily be done with a safety pin. And then I'm going to determine my buttons. I have some choices in mind, so I'm going to do that. I'm going to put on my buttons last. But before I finish this completely, the last thing to do is to take a pointer and push the ends of my drawstring in all the way as far as possible. And I'm going to do that on my waist drawstring as well as my side seam drawstring. And I'm done. And I hope you guys enjoyed this video as much as I enjoyed making it for you. Please, please, please like and subscribe and come back, and I will show you more tips and techniques on how to create these gorgeous outfits.